So, historical context of the James Bond films. Number one, Dr. No. The first two Bond films, Dr. No and From Russia with Love, could only have been made during the Kennedy years. Politically and culturally, there was a very particular moment in history between January 1961, when John F. Kennedy took office as President of the United States, and November 1963, when he was assassinated. Dr. No and From Russia with Love are so closely rooted to that time, that cultural and political moment of the early 60s, that they literally became a part of the history of that time, and for good reason. The Bond novels by Ian Fleming were a hot literary property when they came out in the 1950s. The first of the books, Casino Royale, was published in 1953. That was less than a decade after the end of World War II, and the early Cold War era was kind of a very cynical time in international relations. If you read the early Ian Fleming books, Bond is a very cynical, nihilistic character. He's much less a glamorous spy than he is a glorified hitman. The emphasis in the books is on Bond's role as an assassin and his almost complete lack of empathy. Although the Bond novels were extremely popular in the 50s, and the idea of putting Bond on the silver screen had been floating around for several years, by the time Eon Productions, that's the company that made the films, by the time they finally got started, the cultural moment had changed. 1961, when pre-production began on Dr. No, this was a dangerous time in the world and the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were both ramping up their nuclear weapons capabilities. Previously, the threat of nuclear war, very real since 1949 when the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb. The threat was based on planes, mainly fleets of aircraft, heavy bombers armed with nukes that were in the skies literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By 1961, though, both countries were starting to change the focus of their arsenals from aircraft bombers to ballistic missiles. 1961, the year Dr. No started production, both the US and the USSR launched astronauts into space. Their missions were ostensibly peaceful, but the hardware that got them there were byproducts of the arms race, rockets designed originally to carry nuclear warheads. But 1961 was also a year of optimism. John F. Kennedy came into the White House, the youngest president ever elected, and he called his vision the New Frontier, a new vision of technology, economic expansion, and military and cultural strength, today what we call soft power. And he sought to do better than the Soviets in a more positive way than just weapons. Kennedy was also very glamorous. He was rich and suave, his wife was hot, he drank fashionably, he had a reputation as a playboy. All of those things, except the wife, all of those are true of James Bond, especially as portrayed by Sean Connery. The portrayal of Bond by Connery is quite different, however, than the nihilistic hitman that you see in Fleming's books. I think the film Dr. No really reflects both the scary state of the world in the early 1960s and the suave optimism of those same years. Dr. No is a surprisingly violent film for its time. Bond commits several cold-blooded murders, particularly cold-blooded murders on screen. He's very nasty to women, reflecting the very misogynistic tendencies of the character, and he himself goes through a physical hell in the final scenes in Dr. No's headquarters. Also note the space-related themes in the film. Dr. No's evil plot to hijack American space launches and send them off course. There's even footage in the film of a Mercury space launch. So we have this gee-whiz, space-age tech stuff and the cold-blooded brutality of the spy war. This is very early 60s in its sensibility and in the way it's brought off. Also, we have to talk about what was going on in Britain at the time, because of course the Bond films, after all, were made in Britain primarily with British crews. The Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1961 and 62 was Harold Macmillan, definitely not the young and suave leader that Kennedy was in America. Macmillan was old establishment. He served in World War I, in fact. He was a staunch old Tory. But Britain was changing too. The early 60s was just before the mod era, just before the Beatles, and the British public was ripe for a cultural change. When John Kennedy, and particularly Jackie Kennedy, visited the UK, people went berserk. Paparazzi followed them everywhere. People were always asking, well, why aren't we Britain? Why aren't we more like the US? Even the Queen took a liking to the Kennedys. Queen Elizabeth II was only 36 in 1962, and she and Jackie Kennedy famously bonded, no pun intended. Dr. No was released on October 5th, 1962. That was only weeks before the US and the USSR stared each other down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world never came closer to nuclear war. It was really quite a miracle, in fact, that the superpowers didn't go to war over the edge. The idea of superpower confrontation, especially with a technological dimension, was suddenly very, very real in the real world. And Dr. No tapped in perfectly to that vibe. Stay tuned for the next video, and we'll talk about From Russia with Love.